Marina Rustow is the Kaduri A. Zilka Professor of Jewish Civilization in the Near East, Professor of Near Eastern Studies and History at Princeton University. She earlier served on the faculties of Emory and Johns Hopkins University. Rustow received a bachelor's degree in comparative literature from Yale and master's degrees in history and religion and her PhD from Columbia University. She has said that the literary theory she learned as an undergraduate, and I quote, means that while she welcomes a good methodological discussion, she can sniff gratuitous or decorative uses of theory a mile off. As social historian of the Middle East, Professor Rustow works with an often neglected type of source, medieval documents, especially sources from the Cairo Genizah. Whereas prior scholars of documents in this collection concentrated on texts written in Hebrew and Aramaic, Rustow studies those written in Arabic, and at least for me, she's shown that there's a much longer history to recycling paper by flipping it over than the one that we know from computer printers now. She said of her work that she realized, and I'm quoting now, and I may as well admit that I thought this might be a bit Looney Tunes at first, is that when you're looking at a document, you have to look at both sides, recto and verso. Let's say you're looking at a letter and it was written on the back of a tax receipt. Previous scholarship looked at either the letter or at the tax receipt. I got interested in the question of where the tax receipt went after it was issued to the person who paid their taxes and how it got into the hands of the person who wrote the letter. Professor Rustow's honors include a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and being Fellow at the American Academy of Rome. She will speak to us on finding the lost archive of a medieval Islamic empire in an Egyptian synagogue.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak. It's an honor to be here. All pre-modern historians face the same problem, which is lack of information. Historians like to make use of archives because they're unconscious sources as opposed to texts that are produced for a wide readership or for posterity, so they, in some ways, make more honest historical sources. I also like documents because they're generally only one page long. But documents also have problems. You have to know where to find them, and you have to know how to read them. And when I say how to read them, I don't mean how to interpret them, although that's important too. You actually have to decipher them, and doing that is not always completely straightforward. Another reason that I like the brevity of documents, because no matter how excruciating a decipherment is, the pain will end soon enough. Besides the usual pre-modern history problems, historians of the medieval Middle East face a special challenge. Few documents are believed to have been produced in the region before the Ottoman Empire in the 15th and 16th century, and fewer to have survived. So most of the sources that my field has tended to draw on are narrative texts, like chronicles, produced at the courts of caliphs and sultans, close to the center of power, with the concerns of the ruling elite close to heart. Or else they're legal works, which tell us how the religious elite wanted Muslims to comport themselves, but nothing about the lives of the nameless masses, let alone of non-Muslims, who, for the first 4 centuries of Islamic rule, constituted the vast majority of subjects. So what if we wanted to write the history of the region from the ground up? How would we do this? And would it look different from the accepted narratives? Luckily, there are answers to these questions. One set of answers lies in a cache of texts collectively referred to as the Cairo Genizah. The word Genizah, it's actually shortened for Beit Genizah, which is a Hebrew expression describing a chamber or any receptacle in which disused texts in Hebrew script would be stored before they could be given a proper burial. The idea is that just as the body is a container that once the soul has expired should be given a proper burial, so too books, after they've outlived their usefulness, should be treated with respect, especially if they could contain the name of God. But I suspect that if you went to 11th or 12th century Cairo and did ethnographic research among the inhabitants and asked, why did you put your things into the Genizah, you'd probably get as many answers as you interview people. The synagogue in which the Genizah was found, you can still visit it It's in what was then known as Fustat, which has now been englobed into the larger city of Cairo. This is the alley that you would walk down past some very interesting churches. And you get to the Ben Ezra Synagogue, which looks like this from the outside. It's been completely reconstructed. It's a very fine example of late 19th century Egyptian craftsmanship, because the medieval synagogue, which had been built in the 11th century, was razed to the ground in the late 1880s and rebuilt on the footprint of the old one. Nonetheless, we know, based on descriptions of people who knew the old synagogue from the 19th century, that the portal to the Genizah chamber looked something like that. The contents of the Genizah date mainly from the 3 centuries between 950 and 1250, which is actually a very fortunate thing because it was kind of a black hole in Jewish history, and now we know much more about it. The grand total is about 330,000 pages or fragments of pages distributed now over the globe in about 60 libraries and private collections. Most of what the Genizah contained were books. And I put books in quotation marks because a book could be many things in this period. It could be a scroll, a codex, which is the book form as we know it, the rotulus, which is the book form as we now know it again as PDF, written for posterity, or a book could also be written for personal use. And there's tremendous scribal creativity in what a book actually is. But mainly we're talking about biblical fragments, liturgy, rabbinic texts and commentaries, that kind of thing. And indeed, we would expect most of the Genizah's contents to be religious works such as this because they were found inside a synagogue. So most of the people who deposited their worn-out texts there were probably synagogue officials. But about 10% of the total, and this is a wildly higher estimate than anyone in my field would have given 10 years ago, are documents of the type that might have survived in an archive, had archives actually survived. Now, the Genizah is not an archive because an archive is a set of documents that's preserved for the purposes of easy retrieval, meaning that it has to be organized. The Genizah was basically a gigantic pile of documents and other kinds of texts. So the kinds of things that you would find there among the documents are marriage contracts and all kinds of other legal instruments. This is a trade letter, which is interesting because it was sent by a Jewish trader in Aden in the southern Arabian Peninsula to Mangalore on the Malabar coast of India. And one of the things that the Genizah has done is revealed a burgeoning trade across the Indian Ocean in the late 11th and 12th centuries. This letter is written in Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic written in Hebrew characters. So if you can kind of think about Yiddish as being medieval High German in Hebrew characters, Judeo-Arabic is the equivalent. And I also couldn't resist showing you this doodle. I don't know if Andrea Wolf is still here, but she mentioned doodles as well. Conveniently for me, this doodle is dated. It contains a Judeo-Arabic transcription of an Arabic poem about a prince in procession. So in other words, the Arabic has simply been transcribed into Hebrew characters. And so I imagine that the elephant must have been part of the procession that the doodler witnessed. What's going on in the elephant's head? Well, there's a letter sticking out of it that belongs to the word above the elephant, but on the left of that is probably scales of judgment. And I imagine this is because governors were supposed to hear petitions as they went from village to village. So you find all kinds of things in the Genizah, and that meant that the first 2 generations of scholars who worked on this material beginning in the early 1950s were very excited about the possibilities of writing history from below. So now we know tons about food. It turns out that medieval Cairo may be our earliest example on record of takeout food, which was very common. We know a lot about clothing. People mainly wore flax and sometimes wool. We know a lot about sex. They had more of it than you'd think, not always with their spouses. We know a lot about piety. They had a lot less of it than you'd think. Also, literacy rates, again, less of it than you'd think. About 10% of urban males would be literate on a good day. So this is all very good for Jewish history because the vast majority of Jews, an estimated 90% of them, lived under Islamic rule during the main period that the Genizah covers. The Jews of Northern Europe were still demographically insignificant, and that would persist until about the 16th century. This was also a good find for Middle East history because Jews turned out to be well documented in precisely the areas where religious loyalties were least significant, like trade and daily life. So what you learned about Jews could also tell you a lot about Muslims and Christians. But what the turn to social history didn't tell us much about is the state. The very courts of caliphs so abundantly represented in the Chronicles didn't make much of an appearance in the early works on the Genizah. So people assumed that the Genizah didn't have much to say about the state. But it turns out that the state was right under our noses the whole time. a lot of it. What you're looking at are decrees that have been chopped up and reused for texts in Hebrew script. And I had no idea how many there were when I started working on this material, and it turns out that there are many, many indeed. On the one hand, it stands perfectly to reason that we would see much of the state in the Genizah, because the alleyway to the synagogue that I was showing you before is in Fustat, and Fustat is the medieval residential quarter just south of a spot on which in 969, when a Shiite dynasty called the Fatimids marched on Egypt and conquered it handily from the Abbasids, thus depriving the Abbasid rulers in Baghdad of their main tax-rendering province, the Fatimids built their Palatine city. So this is, you can see the Ben Ezra Synagogue where the Genizah was found on the bottom of this slide. This is one of the monumental gates of Cairo, built about a century after the Fatimid conquest of 969. So what this meant is that the Fatimids became the first rulers since the Ptolemies 1,000 years earlier to rule Egypt from Egypt itself. So you imagine that you would find lots of government documents floating around somewhere near the vicinity of the Genizah. On the other hand, government documents in Arabic script seem to be the last thing that anyone expected to find in the Genizah. The late 19th century collectors who came to the Ben Ezra Synagogue came there for Hebrew script texts, not Arabic script ones, especially for biblical texts. Early catalogers, and even some more recent ones, didn't know what to do with the Arabic material. This is a map of the Foxman Empire. So this is a fiscal document written in Arabic script. It contains some pretty high-level Fatimid titles. I was very excited when I managed to decipher what's left of this a few months ago, but it's been cataloged. I actually feel guilty saying this with Bodley's librarian present in the audience, but I've also told my colleagues at Oxford about this, so this is known now. This is cataloged as illegible. Likewise, at the University of Pennsylvania, these are very good friends of mine, I've told them too. This is the left side of a fiscal record. You can just barely make out some quantities in dinars, but the hand is unmistakably a government fiscal hand. It's cataloged as scribbling in Arabic characters. It got to the point when I was going through the Bodleian's collection of Genizah fragments, about 12,500 of them, a very, very important and very compact sort of hand-picked collection, that every time I opened the 1906 catalog and saw the word scribbling, I got really excited because I knew it was going to be a Fatimid state document. Now, I'm not saying that they're not illegible. If any of you out there knows Arabic, then you can empathize with the plight of those of us who try to decipher these things. The scribes seem to have been allergic to lifting their pens. These are very technical texts. They're written clearly for insiders only, in this case for tax officials. But technical texts are interesting precisely because they demonstrate systems at work: land management, irrigation, production, surveying, extraction, revenue collection, decision-making, the pursuit of justice, rendering justice and fairness. In other words, technical texts also hint that there may be some predictability lurking there. Luckily, I have a postdoc who is very good at reading Fatimid tax documents and taught a number of us how to do it. And if tax receipts seem unglamorous, this is a decree of investiture for a Muslim judge, a qadi. It has very wide line spacing, just like the decree fragments that I showed you earlier, which also makes it vulnerable to reuse. I actually have a colleague who refers to this wide line spacing as the sovereign privilege of waste, the idea being we're the government and we can use as much paper as we want. When I started working on this material, I estimated that there may be about 300 state fragments from the Genizah, and then I immediately felt guilty about the claim because what if it's overblown? But now, the team that I'm working with, we're up to 1,500 unpublished state documents and counting, and we still haven't surveyed the two major collections at Cambridge and JTS. That's on the agenda for the next few years. Some of these texts are fragmentary, and that's where computers enter the picture. This is for Barbara. A combination of facial recognition algorithms and machine learning has been employed to try to find the missing halves of documents, mainly by colleagues of mine who are involved with the Friedberg Genizah Project website, which aims to reunite the fragments of the Genizah digitally. So, for example, if you take this, which is a court record, judging by the handwriting, probably 15th century. This was found by the dissertation of my dissertation advisor at some point in the 1970s. And it's an Arabic legal document written in an Islamic court having to do with a dispute between Jews, which is itself very interesting. But it's only half of the document. So let's say you wanted to find the other half. This technology, these algorithms had just come out, and I said, okay, let me plug this document in. So I put the shelf mark in the little box, and then I hit join suggestions. And I went to the first algorithm, nothing, although I did see some other interesting Arabic documents. And then I went to the second algorithm, and bam, there it is, the bottom half of this document. And we even have a date, 1463. So this is lots and lots of fun to do, as you can imagine. Unfortunately, what these algorithms are mainly coming up with is false positives. One wonders how a quantum computer might do with this. But even the false positives have their utility because you simply see much more material of the type that you're interested in because of the facial recognition software. Now, joins can still be made the artisanal way. This is a join that I found earlier this year. The middle fragment had been published, and I stumbled across the top and the bottom one. Weirdly enough, I was finding a lot of joins in a period of several months, and right around the same time, my sense of direction improved. And I was once giving a talk to some grad students at Princeton. There were neuroscientists present, and these two neuroscience graduate students walked up to me afterwards, and they said, "We know why. It's because your hippocampus has expanded." So who says people can't learn new things in their 40s? So this is a bureaucratic memorandum about the processing of petitions, and it contains 5 different hands. The hands are so similar that when there was one fragment, it really did look like there was only one hand on the page. But in fact, from the 3 fragments together, you can see that this was a document that was passed through different parts of the bureaucracy in the palace. Again, a technical text, and government officials took petitions very, very seriously. Okay, so that brings me to my last set of questions. What does all this mean? What can we actually do with all of these Arabic state documents? What kinds of historical questions can we ask of them, and which ones can we answer? So a conspicuously large proportion of the state documents from the Genizah are petitions, about 10% of the 1,500 that we've identified so far. So this is the largest single group among all the state documents that I've identified. 150 petitions might not be much compared to the thousands of letters that the Genizah has preserved in Hebrew script. But for the subset of Arabic script documents, the prevalence of petitions, and here I mean petitions to caliphs and viziers, petitions that went straight to the top, is quite notable. This one is a petition actually to the sister of a caliph who ruled the state for a period of just over 2 years after her brother mysteriously disappeared, probably was assassinated, until she herself died of dysentery. And dying of dysentery in the Middle Ages usually means you were poisoned. She's recorded in the Chronicles as being very powerful and also as receiving petitions, but it turns out that actual petitions written to her have been preserved in the Genizah. This one is from a farmer in the Fayoum, one of the agricultural regions of Egypt, and he's complaining that he sent his son off. So this is a year, because we know when she ruled, we know that this is a year of a low Nile. And everyone gets nervous when the Nile is low because it means that either prices are going to go up, or if things get really bad and maybe there are 2 low floods in 2 consecutive years, there's going to be famine. So this farmer sends his son to Medinat al-Fayoum, the main city near where they live, with 70 dinars and asks him to bring back some grain. So the son goes to the city and buys 70 bags of grain, and then the petition laconically says the governor made off with them. We don't quite know why, right? Was the government stockpiling? Mysterious. The point is that the father then writes to this princess and says, can you please intercept these bags of grain before they reach the port of Cairo, because they are our property. This, likewise, is a petition complaining about the behavior of a lower official, in this case a qadi, who is serving in the role of governor, again from a father, about the unsolved murder from his son, murder of his son on a Nile boat. This is sort of like an Agatha Christie-like story. These 2 petitions have something in common, which is that they're from total nobodies who, despite their being nobodies, believe that they have the right to legal protection. They believe that they have a right to justice. The other thing they have in common is that they're both complaining about lower officials. One thing they don't have in common is their scribe. Of the 4 main document types that we have so far, decrees, petitions, internal bureaucratic memoranda, and fiscal records. The petitions exhibit the greatest paleographic and diplomatic range, by which I mean the greatest differences in terms of handwriting and the greatest differences in terms of the actual verbal formulae that they use. There's a lot of latitude in writing petitions. Petitions are written by professional scribes. So what this means is that I can identify the petition, the New York petition, the one on the right, as having been written by a rural scribe because his hand has much more in common with rural documents of the period, whereas the one on the left was written by an urban scribe. So that already suggests that scribes who knew how to write petitions are distributed throughout Fatimid territory. And that suggests that there was a whole intermediating class who were really responsible for bringing the complaints of subjects to the government. Again, the Fatimids really cared about petitions. Why? Turns out there's a long tradition of what scholars have termed the circle of justice. And the circle of justice in medieval Middle Eastern political philosophy basically goes like this. You can't have sovereign power without being supported by military force, so you don't need Weber to tell you that. You can't have any military force unless you can collect tax revenue. You can't collect tax revenue unless your subjects are prosperous, and then here's the kicker. Your subjects will not be prosperous unless they have sovereign justice, meaning you can't oppress people too much. Still, I wondered to myself, what really is the link between prosperity and justice? Or at least, how did the Fatimids think about this? So to understand this better, I had to do something very risky, very radical, and very dangerous, which is that I had to read some texts that were longer than one page. This was very challenging, but it was also rewarding because I found that the earliest text to actually make the link between taxation and justice, to make that link explicit, happens to be a Fatimid text. It was a text that was written on the eve of the Fatimid conquest of Egypt from the Abbasids. It was written by the Qadi Nu'man, who, as you can tell by his title, is a judge. He's the chief judge and the chief propagandist of the faith of the Fatimids, meaning he's basically the architect of Fatimid sovereignty. So as the Fatimids are planning the takeover of Egypt, and they had already attempted to conquer Egypt once and failed, so this time they were planning very slowly and very carefully, and they were going to get it right. The Qadi writes a code of law. So half of the code of law is simply how do you practice Islamic law if you happen to be an Ismaili Muslim. But the second volume is basically a mirror for princes. It's how should the governing class comport themselves and what should the military do. So one of the problems that the Qadi deals with is collecting taxes. Why should those who are responsible for paying the land tax on their land trust the new regime? The solution? Call together those who pay the land tax from each locality and bid them make known to you the conditions in their localities, their welfare therein, and the state of their land. Allow them to complain to you about a heavy tax, about damage they have suffered through the cutting off of irrigation water or soil destruction by inundation, etc. In other words, basically, be kind to them, hear their complaints, and above all, if you remit their taxes now, when they're suffering, you will reap the benefits later. Oppression doesn't work. Second problem he deals with is who should they complain to? The technical skills for administration, both taxation and petition writing, are to be found among officials of the old regime, but you can't very well trust officials of the Abbasids. The worst among your confidants and viziers are those who used to be confidants and viziers of the wicked, meaning the Abbasids, who participated in their crimes and rendered them service. They're companions of tyrants and the aides of criminals. They're like ravening wolves. What's the solution? He recommends set up a sovereign court of complaints. Use subjects' complaints against your lower officials. That way, if the emir runs off with 70 sacks of your grain, you actually have redress, and this emir can be punished by having his ill-gotten gains confiscated by the government. So win-win for everybody except for the emir. So what's the point? Is that this Qadi makes a great show of concern for the welfare of the weakest members of society. I'll just read the last quotation here. The emaciated of the flock have more need of just treatment and solicitude than do the plump ones. So the Fatimids are concerned with hearing out their subjects. They're equally concerned with regulating the behavior of their officials. And the way to do that is to turn subjects toward the sovereign and away from the mid-level officials. So this explains the large number of petitions in the Genizah compared to other document types. Allowing subjects to complain was a point of sovereign ideology and also of state legitimation. And of course, it also helped in the collecting of taxes. So this helps explain why Fatimid petitions exhibit such a loose family resemblance resemblance in their diplomatic and philological features. They were written all over Fatimid territory by mid-level officials who had to conform just enough to the new scribal style to prove that they were part of the new regime, but they probably had no serious formal training by the state. And it also explains why some of the language that you get in these petitions is surprisingly direct. Petitioners repeatedly invoke their rights. The Arabic word for that is hukuk. They make demands of the sovereign. One local judge is even cheeky enough to tell the caliph that if his rival is granted a decree of investiture, the rival of this local judge, this will destroy the caliph's honor, his role as patron, and his capacity to grant benefactions. And it also explains why nearly all petitions are phrased as complaints against other mid-level officials, even when they aren't. So, for example, there was two groups of Jews I wrote about in my first book who had a major conflict in the 1040s, and what they really wanted to complain about was each other, but one group instead complained the official that you sent to mediate our dispute didn't do a very good job of it. So why was the petition phrased that way? Because when you complained about mid-level officials, the caliphs would listen. Now, before I conclude, let me say this is work that I'm currently writing up in an ever-growing book manuscript. And the paragraph that I'm about to read to you, I wrote in July. So any relevance to living persons or to the events of earlier this week is entirely accidental, even if my decision to conclude with this paragraph was not accidental. Fatimid solicitousness toward the weak was a form of sovereign-sponsored populism, if you'll forgive the apparent paradox. It was an alliance between the chief executive and the weakest members of society. This kind of populism is a strategy that rulers have employed in political situations too numerous to count, and it is hardly specific to the pre-modern world. But in medieval monarchies, populism created less ideological obfuscation and mischief than it does in modern nation-states. Modern populist movements, and the theoretical literature deals nearly exclusively with the modern variety, pitch themselves against elites that they deem to be established, entrenched, or corrupt. But they perform a lot of ideological obfuscation because they hide the fact that demagogues are no less an elite motivated by self-interest. Medieval sovereigns were more honest than modern politicians about what it takes to satisfy people's needs, not the popular will, but sovereign benevolence. So the nuances of the relationship between state and society teach us that the difference between the medieval Islamic world and early modern Europe isn't the belief in rights, but how rights were invoked, defended, and granted. And that's all recoverable from reused documents if one just notices the scribbling.
Balcony. Michael.
Mike McCormick in Cambridge. Thank you, Marina. That was wonderful, as always. You know how much admiration I have for your work. A question that you probably, or perhaps have already pondered in this amazing voyage of discovery into the lost and fabulous administrative archives of the medieval Islamic world. So you point out that so far, the petition-type documents outnumber, and apparently considerably, the truly administrative documents emerging from the court with official scribes and so forth. Is there any chance that the proportion between the two types of documents preserved in the Genizah gives us some insight into the proportion of the documents as they actually existed in the Fatimid archives? In other words, that petitions were far more numerous in the at least in the incoming and outgoing business of the court than the government-generated documents? Or is it possible that there is a differential discard pattern, that petitions are less important, so the government dumps them and people acquire them more easily?
Absolutely. The whole question of preservation is a very, very interesting one, and I can answer it for you in 600 pages or less. But now I'll try to give you the short version. I've done a lot of thinking about how these documents actually made their way from the palace in Cairo to the synagogue in Fustat. There was a whole journey before they were even discarded. In other words, we know why they made it into the Genizah because they ended up with Hebrew script on them, but how did they get into the hands of the people who wrote Hebrew script on them? And it turns out you kind of have to go genre by genre. So the decree fragments that I was showing you, and I can actually pull up a really nice drawing that I myself am not responsible for. These decree fragments universally, I have not found a decree fragment that does not conform to the following description: cut down the middle vertically. So it seems that what the government did is, when they issued a kind of fancy-looking decree, either to petitioners or else to provincial governors who were receiving orders, the provincial governors would receive these decrees, but they wouldn't archive them. There was no need for them to archive them, because in fact, what the government did was archived decrees in a much more sensibly compact form as by folios. So this is a copy of a decree that was actually found with 4 holes in the middle, suggesting that it was bound into an archive, probably in the palace. So the decrees seem to have gone sort of at large, and they may in fact have gotten into the hands of used paper sellers, and that's how the people who reused them got their hands on them. For other genres, there's a completely different path that you have to assume. So the interesting thing about the petitions that have been preserved in the Genizah is that the vast majority of them have absolutely nothing to do with Jews. So if we found petitions from Jews, we think, okay, well, that's normal. These are Jewish petitions. They're hanging around the Jewish community. Makes sense. But petitions that have nothing to do with Jews, you have to posit other channels of transmission. So one option is that you had actual officials who were Jewish who were writing petitions. That's certainly possible. But I think it's very likely that another path of transmission is that Jews made a deliberate effort to get their hands on petitions because they needed to know how to phrase them, how to draft them, and how to write them. We have some very interesting cases of draft petitions where you have multiple drafts, and you can see the conflict I was telling you about from 1040 between these two groups of Jews. We actually had 8 drafts of this petition. And you can see the petition writer attempting to kind of phrase and rephrase things in the best possible way. So I think one of the reasons that so many petitions were circulating in the Jewish community was that they needed models of how to write. With the tax documents, it's a totally different story. We happen to have this one Jewish tax farmer, and we've managed to reconstruct an archive of 36 of the tax receipts that he collected. For the fiscal documents, there's a particular Jewish courtier who works in the fiscal administration for about 30 years, and he has a lot of truck with the Jewish community. So basically, there's no one-size-fits-all answer, and that means we have to be very, very careful about the kinds of conclusions that we draw in terms of what's been preserved and what hasn't. So whether or not the significance of so many petitions, is something I'm going to stick to, I don't quite know yet.
Hi.
Frank Stewart, New York. How did you reach your estimate of the level of literacy?
Oh, yes. So I spent about 6 months thinking about this, and I sort of had to work both ends against the middle, which is to say, I looked very carefully. It turns out we know a lot about education and how education was actually done and managed in this world. And then I also looked at such things as signatures on legal documents, and tried to sort of tally up. I mean, you can tell immediately somebody who hasn't learned to write in a kind of flowing Hebrew script but is writing in awkward block letters. And then I spent a lot of time thinking about what literacy really means. In other words, I often compare it to musical literacy. So many of us can carry a tune, but can't read notes. Some of us learned to read notes in grade school, but we've forgotten. Some of us kept reading notes for a while, and so we can actually follow along with a score. And then very, very, very few of us can be handed the score of a Beethoven symphony and hear all the parts in our head simultaneously. So when I divided literacy levels up that way, and then figured out kind of who was being educated, the figure that I came up with was, I would say, somewhere in the 5 to 10% range in terms of meaningful literacy, meaning that, let's say, Maimonides, like you can read and write any text you want. And that's actually a very high level for this period. So then what I did is I compared it with other estimates of pre-modern literacy, especially the work that's been done on literacy in the Roman world. And realized that Jews actually were fairly literate, and the reason I think is pretty clear, because they were highly urbanized. So when you live in urban centers, you need more literacy in order to conduct the kinds of professions that tend to happen in urban centers as opposed to working the land. So that's the long and short of the literacy estimate.
So we need to end. Let's thank Marina very much.